Fresh off of the back of the Battlefield 6 open beta, there was some news that dropped yesterday that brought me crashing right back down to earth. There's a claim making the rounds at the moment that EA wants to annualise the Battlefield franchise. Now, if you've been following Battlefield over the years, you'll know that the idea raises a lot of questions, a lot of fears, and potentially further comparisons to a certain other FPS franchise. So today, we're going to dig into what this could mean for the series, why I personally think it's not a very good idea, and why, despite the size of the franchise and the amount of people that are working on it these days, this move might not be as straightforward as it sounds for Battlefield. If you go on to enjoy this video, please drop a like for the almighty YouTube algorithm and subscribe for more Battlefield 6 content. We'll be covering it all the way through till launch and beyond. So this report that's been picked up by several different outlets now, I believe the source is industry analyst Michael Patcher. I think that's how you pronounce his name. Sorry if I got it wrong. He was in conversation with Byron Beede, the general manager of the Battlefield franchise. Now, it's claimed that during the conversation they had, Beede stated the goal with Battlefield is to have 3 studios making a game on a 3-year basis, so they can get to Battlefield annually. Apparently, Beede continued on to state that he thinks it's going to take 5 or 6 years for that plan to really come into place, to even get 2 games in a row year after year. So it's unlikely we're going to see Battlefield annualized for quite some time at this point. But the goal is to directly catch up and compete with Call of Duty, which has been an annual franchise for, what, nearly 2 decades at this point. Now, I've got to say, this is something that scares me as a Battlefield fan for many different reasons. And quite honestly, I think I've got all the evidence from the past 15 years or so from the franchise to prove why this is not a good idea. I've been burned personally many times by Battlefield. I know that a lot of you guys out there as well feel like you've been burned too. And that's despite this franchise being my absolute favourite on the planet. And we have just now seen it climb back up to the table after years of floating off in the doldrums after 2 poor releases and lackluster support schedules. So, forgive me if I'm not all sold on the idea of getting a new Battlefield game every single year. I've got some thoughts and opinions, and I'd love it if you could leave yours down below in the comments as well. Firstly, I'm seriously concerned about quality. Increasing the release cadence almost always comes at the expense of polish, and Battlefield's history kind of already proves this. If you take Battlefield Hardline as an example, it was originally set to launch in autumn 2014, just a year after Battlefield 4, in what was arguably EA's first attempt at increasing the number of releases for the franchise. But the game simply wasn't ready at that point. Fan sentiment was pretty poor, the product felt unfinished when it was first shown off, and launch had to be delayed until March 2015, where admittedly, the product was more polished, but it still hadn't shaken that lukewarm reception. Meanwhile, Battlefield 4 was still receiving major updates and fixes to bring it up to a standard that gamers actually expected, and very few of those improvements carried over to Hardline when it was first shown off in open beta in 2014. On top of that, the shift to a cops and robbers theme was met with a very meh reception, making Hardline feel like a rushed experiment more than a worthy successor to Battlefield 4. We've seen a similar story even further back with Medal of Honor Warfighter. Whilst that wasn't a Battlefield title, it was heavily marketed off the back of Battlefield 3's launch, and it looked like EA's attempt to establish a second FPS franchise that could alternate releases with Battlefield. But despite some unique mechanics, it never really resonated with the wider FPS audience, and EA abandoned it shortly after launch. Both of those cases, Hardline and Warfighter, they highlight a similar problem. When you rush to fill a release slot rather than letting another game mature, the end result is that that product feels half-baked, and players are going to notice that. Then there's the issue of player fatigue when a franchise starts releasing a new game every single year. We can already see this happening with Call of Duty. With so many near-identical titles dropping one after another, players are becoming increasingly vocal about wanting something fresh and different. And ironically, this is exactly why Battlefield 6 drew so much attention at its announcement and during the open beta. It felt like a genuine alternative to the status quo. But if Battlefield were to adopt the same annualized model, it risks falling into exactly the same trap. Call of Duty has even blurred the lines between its own sub-franchises. with Modern Warfare 3 following on directly from Modern Warfare 2, instead of being broken up by a Black Ops entry or something from Sledgehammer, and now Black Ops 7 is going to arrive immediately after Black Ops 6. The community reaction has been lukewarm to that at best, and pretty negative at its worst, highlighting just how quickly oversaturation can backfire. So can you imagine Battlefield 6 being followed almost instantly by Battlefield 7, Battlefield 8, and then Battlefield 9, each maybe recycling assets and mechanics just to keep the conveyor belt moving? There wouldn't be any breathing room for players to even miss the previous game before the next one lands right in front of them. And whilst EA might see this as a way to keep retention levels up for the entire franchise, the danger is that the hype and anticipation that you get for every single game, and that's two things that have always been critical to Battlefield's big launches, all of that could disappear very, very quickly if you get too much fatigue with your player base. And speaking of that player base, let's talk about the potential fragmentation of it. If Battlefield moves to annual releases, the player base could end up being split across multiple franchise entries, with different groups sticking to the games that they prefer, whilst others move on. And that kind of does already happen with Battlefield, but if you have more games because you're releasing one every single year, the issue could get even worse. Instead of the community rallying around one main Battlefield game, say every 2 to 3 years, you'd end up with smaller pockets of players scattered across several titles. Not only does that weaken the sense of a unified player base and potentially weaken the player numbers of each individual title, but it also creates a much higher development cost, which is a factor here, because EA would have to maintain and support even more titles at the same time. We've already seen this happen with Call of Duty. A portion of the audience sticks with Black Ops because they like features like zombies, whilst others prefer Modern Warfare, or even some of the Sledgehammer-developed games for its own style and mechanics. And all of those sub-franchises kind of end up competing against each other. The only thing that's really keeping that community tied together is Warzone, which bridges all of those sub-franchises under one roof. And Battlefield doesn't have that luxury right now, although EA might be banking on its own rumoured free-to-play Battle Royale to serve a similar purpose later this year. But even then, it's far from guaranteed to solve the problem. Now, one counter to this point, I will say, is Portal. This is going to allow players the freedom and the control to continue playing Battlefield 6 well beyond its intended content lifecycle. You've got rented servers there and the map editor. So that is one area where actually having support for multiple titles at once does work well. Another concern that I've got is the potential loss of Battlefield's identity. The franchise has always stood apart from others in the market because of its massive maps, its destruction, the vehicles, the team play focus, and that sandbox freedom that makes every single match unique. Each new Battlefield usually feels like its own unique event. We had Battlefield 1's World War I setting, there was Battlefield 3's modern military tone, and even 2042 with its more experimental specialists, even if that direction wasn't something that people really wanted or asked for. So whether you love them or not, each release tries something different. But with annual releases, all that breathing room just completely disappears. There's no time for bold experiments or new ideas. Instead, games just start recycling assets, recycling ideas and mechanics just so that deadlines can be met. And we've seen this with other franchises. It's still happening right now. Call of Duty at least has multiple different studios working on sub-franchises, like I mentioned, Modern Warfare and Black Ops. But even then, players are now starting to complain that they all feel the same. They share so many mechanics these days. And once a franchise kind of loses its sense of identity, I think time is really the only option to get that to return, as we've seen with Battlefield 6. It's not going to launch until nearly 4 years after Battlefield 2042. And another major concern, one that I think is actually really important that we speak about, is the impact on both the studios making Battlefield and the long-term trust from the community. Annualization of Battlefield would put an enormous amount of pressure on developers and different teams working on it. Battlefield games are already some of the most ambitious shooters out there. You've got huge maps, vehicles, destruction, all the live service plans and updates that come with it, and even with like years of development time, the launches for Battlefield games have often been quite rocky. So forcing studios into a yearly cycle almost guarantees more crunch, more burnout, and more rushed features just to meet those deadlines. And of course, all of that directly affects how players experience the game. As I've mentioned, Battlefield has already had its fair share of rush launches, with the likes of Battlefield 4 and 2042 needing months, sometimes years of fixes before they felt complete, or at least at the level they should be. If annualization turns that into a pattern where every release is seen as buggy and half-baked, or just another stopgap before we get to another game, then community trust, which right now is already fragile even after the Battlefield 6 open beta, that could collapse completely. The situation is already present with Call of Duty, with each release seemingly re-revealing issues that were already fixed in the previous game, and buggy launches becoming the new normal. In an era where gamers expect their favorite shooters to improve and evolve over time, the idea of pumping out a Battlefield game every year feels like the exact opposite of what a community actually wants. Battlefield 4 is probably the greatest example of what a Battlefield game can and should be. Now, sure, it did have a rough start, I will give it that, but about 9 months after launch, the game was in a much better place, and the development team still managed to not only get to that position, but they delivered new content and features throughout that time, through the rest of the premium season pass, and even pushed on after that with a community test environment and an entire 18 months of free content updates, several new maps, weapons, and additional improvements. The game was like the Battlefield live service before live service was even a thing. EA risks damaging not just the studios behind Battlefield, but also the long-term health of the franchise by pushing for it to become an annual event. I really don't think it's a good idea. So to sort of sum this all up, annualizing Battlefield might be like a quick way for EA to compete with Call of Duty here, but the risks massively outweigh the rewards, I think. We've seen what happens when franchise chase those yearly releases. You get quality drops. Players kind of burn out and sort of lose interest because each game feels very close to the previous one. The community splinters because certain features won't make it from one game to the other, and they'll stick around because they like that and they don't like the next one. The unique identity that once made the series special starts to fade away. It all starts to go downhill. For a franchise that's already had rocky launches and struggles to win back trust in its past, going down this road feels like a little bit of a recipe for disaster. That said, we don't know for certain that this all could happen. This could be completely unfounded. And maybe, just maybe, EA is capable of pulling it off in a way that proves us all wrong. There are a lot of people at the top of the Battlefield franchise right now, the likes of Vince Zampella and Byron Beede, who have been in positions in the past and have come through and massively delivered, even though there have been fears about what those people have been doing. So maybe, just maybe, it could all come good. But for me personally, I think I'd rather Battlefield avoided that path altogether. I like the build-up to a new game that comes after a period of downtime. But what do you think? Would annualizing Battlefield breathe new life into the series and really push it forward? Or would it be like, I don't know, the beginning of the end, so to speak? Drop your thoughts down below in the comments. I really would love to hear them. I know there's going to be a lot of varied opinions here, but honestly, it just caught my attention when I saw this news article the other day, and I thought, hey, let's talk about it. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe if you're new here, and make sure you click that notification bell so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.